All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this new experiment, a different kind of event. I don't know if any of you have been with us in another event that we did this afternoon when I spoke about about Rabbi Soloveitchik, Joseph Soloveitchik. We had an event which was both in person as well as online. And this is just an example of the kind of public programs that we offer to people, not just in Phoenix, but in many other places all over the United States. So this evening, we're going to start something new. It's a unique series of 3 presentations / discussion / reading. The title is American Jewish Literature, and Professor Brian Goodman is going to be our leader. He conceived the series and he put it together in the way that we're all going to enjoy tonight and 2 more, whatever it is, I guess, a Wednesday, but I don't have the dates in my head.
I'll go over them.
Take words about Professor Goodman. He's in. What's that?
Oh, I just said I'll go over the
sorry?
dates, and I said I'll be able to go over the exact dates.
Okay, good. So Brian Goodman is assistant professor in the Department of English at ASU. He was trained in American Studies, and he holds a BA from Stanford University, an MA from Oxford University, and a PhD from Harvard University. The Harvard PhD is from 2016. He's a literary historian, and he focuses on various fields, quite an unusual cluster of fields: American Studies, American Jewish Literature, Cold War Studies, Central and East European Studies, and Transnational Studies. And Jewish Studies fits into this cluster in a very interesting way. His research and his teaching ranges across all those fields. His first book, the title of which is The Nonconformists, and the subtitle is American and Czech Writers Across the Iron Curtain. That book was published by Harvard University Press, 2023, and received a very distinguished literary award. So it's really a wonderful book. I highly recommend that you all read it. I think it's an outstanding model of interdisciplinary research, and it traces literary and cultural exchanges between East and West during the Cold War era. He focuses on individual authors who played crucial role in that story. Now, the interesting thing for us from the perspective of Jewish studies is that Jewish authors, translators, editors, publishers, playwrights, intellectuals all take part in this very complex, intricate story. It really reads like a mystery novel, and I highly recommend that you read the book. I enjoy it tremendously. You probably know, if you've been with us in previous presentations, that he already lectured for Jewish studies on Philip Roth, I think also on Bruno Schulz, on Franz Kafka, and several other people who are less known, who belong to the dissident culture of the Czech Republic. So he's going to focus on the reception history of the Diary of Anne Frank, more generally, the construction of Jewish memory, Jewish memory of the Holocaust in the post-war years. Excuse me. So, Brian, Professor Goodman, please. Screen is yours. Produce kind of an overview of the series and what you want to accomplish and so forth.
Yeah, I'm going to just share some slides because it includes sort of a schedule and a few other things I want to show you today. And so I'm going to get this going first of all, and hopefully you'll all be able to see it in just a minute. Hold on, just got to play. Now you should be all able to see the screen that I'm sharing. Of course, someone, unmute yourself and shout if it's not working. So we are experimenting with a new format. So please, be patient with us as we work out the kinks and figure out how this works. One idea we had here was that we thought it'd be interesting if we brought together some of the members of our regular audience, new to audience members, but do something a little different. In the past, I've worked with colleagues to give lecture series on topics including, literature after the Holocaust. We had a Cold War focused lecture series recently. And the idea here is actually something a little bit more focused on a set of questions and interrelated texts. And we wanted to invite you all to read those texts. And then I would tell you something about them. And then ideally, we'll have time to talk about them and ask questions about these texts and be in conversation together. Now, that's always easier said than done, especially with technology. So we're going to work out the kinks. I have a lot I want to share with you today. I'll share what I think are some of the interesting questions that can kind of guide our discussion series. And we'll see if we can get a conversation started. But my goal really is to have this build over the coming weeks. As you'll see here, the title of the series is Arguments with a Ghost. And today's focus is on a text, an essay written by Cynthia Ozick called Who Owns Anne Frank? And so that question, who owns Anne Frank? It's a provocative question, obviously. It's a question posed by Cynthia Ozick in 1997 in a classic New Yorker essay we'll talk about. But we're going to use that essay and that question to frame our reading for the entire series. And we're going to look next at fiction by Philip Roth and Nathan Englander, two authors who are grappling with the paradoxes of American Jewish identity and also the fraught relationship between art, life, and Holocaust memory. So I was sort of preparing for today, and I was trying to think of, how I was going to introduce sort of some of the themes of the series. And would you believe I go to the New York Times this morning and I see this article? Maybe some of you saw it today. Bringing Anne Frank's Secret Annex to New York and the World. If you haven't read it, if you didn't see it today, I'd highly recommend reading this. It's a very interesting article about a new exhibit that they're opening at a Museum of Jewish History in New York City. And what's fascinating for me is that it actually brings out a lot of the themes from today's reading and indeed from the series. So I won't summarize the entire article, but just to say a word about some of the issues that are raised. So one of the people sort of opening the exhibition said that Anne Frank, the exhibition, is the answer of the so I should say that it's sort of co-organized by the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. So they're bringing all this material to New York City, and this is the quote: they want to look at how this history, how this memory will go into the 21st century. And I think that's one thing a question I want hovering in the background of the series, using these texts from the late 20th century to think about what Anne Frank's memory should mean in the context of the century we're living in now. And it's not a straightforward question. So one issue that they raised in this article that I thought was absolutely fascinating is that I've actually never visited, maybe some of you have, but I've never visited the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. But in Amsterdam, if you visit the museum, the annex where Anne Frank and her family were hiding during the war is completely empty, except for a few scraps of material on the wall, including some of Anne's own pictures of movie stars and artworks that she'd hung up. And the reason it was mostly empty is because Otto Frank, her father, had requested that the spaces, which had been plundered by the Nazis, would remain vacant. And he thought that their barrenness would sort of attend to the profound loss represented by what had happened, right, in this space. Meanwhile, in the New York exhibition, where they recreate the entire annex, all the rooms, painstakingly using historical artifacts and details, they actually recreate the spaces as they would have existed while Anne Frank and her family and the other people hiding in the building, exactly how they would have lived, right? Like, so before the Nazis would have plundered the space. And so you can already see that we're opening up a controversy about memory, right? What's the proper way to memorialize the space? Leave it empty the way it was sort of desecrated by the Nazis who raided it, or to recreate the sort of the sense of life that once existed within those walls. So it's tricky territory is what I'm saying. And the article does a good job of opening that up. It mentions maybe the most recent sort of famous, well-known American Jewish writer who's commented on this question is Dara Horn. Maybe some of you are familiar with Dara Horn. but Dara Horn, who maybe we'll bring back up in some future conversations as we move forward through time, is one of the sort of critics of the way that Anne Frank's memory has been commercialized, and the way that her diary has been turned into a symbol of easy uplift. Here I'm quoting. All of this, which is in the news today, has a much longer history. And that's one of the things I wanted to kind of bring into our conversation. Here's the diary itself in its first American edition. And before we even get into the schedule, so this is going to be our first experiment with a bit of the technology, and we'll see if I can even see the response. But I'm wondering if who has read the diary already at some point in their life, when they were perhaps a school child or long ago. And if you're able to raise your hand either visually or there's a little icon that you can use in the chat, or you can even write something into the chat. Even today in my classes, a lot of hands go up. And maybe I should open the question even wider in terms of the current text under discussion. Maybe who has either read The Diary of Anne Frank, seen a play adaptation, or the film, right? Some version of the Anne Frank story. I suspect that many of us have or are familiar with the text. I read it early on when I was in school, and it was a long time ago. And so one thing I was thinking recently is how, I teach all the things we're reading in this series. How would I get students who hadn't read it or maybe read it 10 years ago to be reacquainted? And what I discovered, and I'm not sure this is up the audience's alley, but I'd highly recommend it. This is a graphic adaptation of the diary, and it's incredibly illustrated. Graphic novels are actually a really important form of literary remembrance of the Holocaust in the 21st century and in the 20th century indeed. So it's a really useful teaching tool. But if anybody's looking for, I highly recommend either picking up, if you have time, the diary and rereading it. It's really extraordinary as a work of literature, or even one of these graphic adaptations. But it's good to know that so many of you are at least familiar with that core text, which will kind of haunt our entire discussion over the next several months. So here's the schedule. So today our core text is going to be Cynthia Ozick's essay, Who Owns Anne Frank? And then here we have on Wednesday, February 26th, we have more than a month just to say, to prepare and read Philip Roth's novel, The Ghostwriter. I'll talk a little bit more about The Ghostwriter at the end of today's presentation, because I want to give you a little bit of useful background, but it's an extraordinary novel. I know Philip Roth is a polarizing author for some. I will say, I think that this is his strongest novel. If you're someone who read, a book like Portnoy's Complaint, or indeed one of his works like The Human Stain or American Pastoral, I think you might be surprised by this novel. And I couldn't recommend it more. It's under 200 pages. So if you're able to go find a copy at your library or purchase a copy, I really, really would encourage you to read it before our next meeting on February 26th. Then a full month after that, on March 26th, we'll meet and we'll round out the series by reading and discussing a short story by Nathan Englander called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. It's quite short. And what we'll do is that'll give us an opportunity to actually bring all these texts into conversation together. So if you're someone who hasn't read Cynthia Ozick's essay, Who Owns Anne Frank, if you had trouble getting access, we encourage you still to find it and read it, because it'll really, I think, illuminate the discussions we have over the next two meetings. And I'll make sure that I send out a clean PDF that I give to my students if you're having trouble with access. Or you can always email me and I can get you a copy if that's easiest. So that's the schedule. That's the plan.
Brian, Brian, it's Lisa. I'll just everyone who signed up, I will send the PDF to.
Great. Why don't we actually, just so Lisa's going to send out a clean PDF for those who don't have New Yorker access, so that you can get access to the entire essay. We'll talk about it today. I'll try to introduce some what I think the important issues and questions that are raised by Ozick. And I'll give background on the essay. One thing I was wondering, actually, maybe in the same spirit of the last question, is how many people were able to access and read the essay? I just want to gauge familiarity. If you could put your hands up or respond in the chat, that'd be great. And if you weren't, this, don't worry at all. We understand. We just want to get a sense. Great. So it sounds like sort of many of us have, some of us haven't. That's fine. We're going to have a conversation, and we'll see how far we can get today. And like I said, today's all about setting up the series. Okay. I'm going to pause here. Any questions before we jump right in? If we haven't already, I guess. Anybody have any questions? I want this to be kind of as informal as we can make it. If there's anything during the conversation, while I'm talking, if you have questions, you can raise your hand, you can drop something in the chat, you can interrupt me, I don't mind. So just let us know. We do have one question. Are you sending out all the essays? We're going to send out the PDF of Cynthia Ozick's essay, Who Owns Anne Frank? And also we'll send out a scan in the coming weeks of the short story from Nathan Englander. We will get in big trouble if we send a pirated copy of a novel, though, so you'll have to find the Philip Roth novel somehow on your own. But it's well worth it. I really think it's worth buying a copy. Okay, cool. Let's jump in then. And again, just chime in if anybody has questions or anything they want to throw into the conversation while I start setting things up. So this is a famous quotation from Cynthia Ozick that I think provides some background maybe for where she's coming from in her essay, Who Owns Anne Frank? If we blow into the narrow end of the shofar, we will be heard far. But if we choose to be mankind rather than Jewish and blow into the wider part, we will not be heard at all. For us, America will have been in vain. Now I'm going to pause for a second, and I want you to all just get a chance to read this quote to yourself and, maybe try to digest it for a second. There's a lot to think about here. One, this is a quote I always use. So I teach a course on American Jewish writers. It's set during mostly the Cold War period, but it really takes the sweep of the 20th century. This is a really important thematic introduction to the course. And one reason that's true is because it introduces a central tension that you see in American Jewish writing, which is a conflict, a debate, a disagreement, an argument over the value of the universal versus the value of the particular, right? And this plays out in many different ways. Most obviously in the period I study over the question of assimilation, right, into mainstream American culture for especially the descendants of Jewish immigrants from, in particular, East Central Europe. But what you see here also is that it's a question being expressed in terms of the conflict of American and Jewish identities. A further point that I think is worth stating at the outset is that for Ozick, this question is really animated by or heightened by the experience and memory of the Holocaust. So for those who don't know Cynthia Ozick, I hope this essay, if nothing else, will send you looking for more of Ozick's writing, either her fiction or her criticism. So Ozick was born in 1928, and like a lot of the writers I study, she was born in the US, in the Bronx, to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. A lot of the writers I study are the children or second generation descendants of immigrants from what used to be called the Pale of Settlement, or from East Central Europe. Cynthia Ozick had literary ambitions from a very early age. I'd say her two biggest influences: one, she was raised in the milieu of a group of mostly Jewish, but not all Jewish, writers, critics, philosophers who were called the New York intellectuals. And they published in a few most often in a few magazines like Partisan Review, Commentary. And there's so much we could say about this group. I teach them in my courses. I'm happy to talk about them if people have questions. But I think one of the things to say about them, there's a few things that I just mentioned briefly. One is that they were attracted to a style of intellectual argument that I think in the 21st century can take us aback, can startle us. They stated things directly. There's a really great new book that just came out that tries to examine the New York intellectuals from the perspective of sort of gender, and the sort of a certain kind of performance of muscular Jewish masculinity, but that was put into the prose style of their writing. And many of the first generation New York intellectuals were men, but there are some of the most important sort of consequences of this intellectual formation were people influenced by the New York intellectuals like Cynthia Ozick or Susan Sontag, who took up aspects of their kind of intellectual style. So I'd say that's one important influence. The other is that she did her master's thesis on Henry James at Ohio State and is really influenced by the novelist Henry James. And you have to read some of her fiction to really see that, but I think you can see it even in the essay we read because of her kind of at times Baroque sentence style, her use of kind of loves just sort of complex syntax, and really, some of her sentences you have to chew on. She published her first book, The Pagan Rabbi, in 1971. She published The Shawl, one of her most famous works, about 9 years later in 1980, which was a story that deals directly with the experiences of the concentration camp. I teach this in my course. I also, maybe it's worth mentioning just for context for the conversation today, I just finished designing an online master's course for ASU on Holocaust and genocide in literature. This is one of the texts I teach. So if you're curious about it, I'm happy to talk about it. Another text I'm really interested that she wrote that also deals with sort of the memory of the Holocaust is The Messiah of Stockholm, which deals with the memory of Bruno Schulz, a writer that Hava mentioned in the introduction, who I'm very interested in. A Polish Jewish writer, an extraordinary writer who was killed during the Second World War in a pogrom. And then a decade later in 1997, she writes this essay, Who Owns Anne Frank, that we're going to talk about today. And I think if you take a step back, you realize that a lot of her fiction, and indeed her criticism, because she's an astounding critic and essayist, asks a central question, which is, what does it mean aesthetically and morally to be Jewish in America after the Holocaust? And you can see that question right in that quote I opened with, but also in the essay we're discussing today. Like I said, The Shawl is, if you're interested, is probably the next place I'd tell you to go if you're interested by this essay. It includes a short story that's, again, very short, set in the camps, but it also has a sort of 80-page novella about one of the central characters from that story who is a survivor and living in Florida. And it's really an astounding work for those who haven't read it. Has anybody read it? I love keep asking this. Well, I'm glad at least some people have read it. I think it gives you a sense of her style. We do have a question in the chat. Would you please break down what her question means? Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious. Well, maybe this is an experiment. Does anybody want to take a stab at what they think it means? Let's see if anybody steps up to the plate. Otherwise, I'm happy to kind of chime in, but I'd be really curious. Feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat. raise your hand, whatever you want to do. I know we're all probably a little bit shy about something as complicated as that quote.
If they want to raise their hand, I can unmute them if they want to ask.
Cool, cool. So the question is about the shofar, right? If you blow into the narrow end of the shofar, you'll be heard far, but if you blow into the wide end of the ram's horn, right, no one will hear you. And Ozick's a big fan of metaphor, obviously. So the wide end of the shofar is meant to represent a kind of universal kind of perspective. Oh, sorry, Rabbi Sachs, that wasn't the question that you meant. I apologize. Maybe I misunderstood. Feel free to correct me in what you were wondering. In the meantime, I will race ahead, and we can always come back to it, because I think sorry, yeah, I know the question at the end of the last slide, I think. So let's go back. I'll put the question back, right? Her fiction and her criticism asks a question: what does it mean aesthetically and morally to be Jewish in America after the Holocaust? And I think that question is in conversation. And so I don't have the answer to that question, that's for sure. But I do think that question animates some of her concerns in Who Owns Anne Frank, which we'll be able to. I think that essay is a useful example for exploring the question. Let's see. So, like I said, this essay appeared in the October 6, 1997 issue of the New Yorker magazine. And I'm wondering if anybody in the chat or on Zoom can guess what was the occasion for this essay. Why in 1997 might Ozick be taking up the question of Anne Frank? Anybody have any guesses or remember? I was just a kid, so I didn't remember this. The new edition of the diary is a great guess. I think the really important edition that came out was earlier in the 90s. That was the unexpurgated version, right? That included all the material that Otto Frank had removed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's a great guess. Oh, challenges to the veracity and authenticity of the writing. Really interesting guess too. Right. And I don't know a whole lot about the history of those challenges, but of course, it's sort of a species of Holocaust denial that has recurred at several points. Well, the more direct answer, which comes exactly, we got just the answer just came in the chat, just as I was about to say. So there was a Broadway revival of the Anne Frank play. So here we have right the poster from the 1955 play, which will come up in our conversation, I'm sure. But I thought I'd play a clip that I found that brings us back to 1997. So this is, if you're imagine you're Cynthia Ozick, you've had a long day at the writing desk, and you sit down after dinner to the nightly news, and this is what comes on. Oops, it didn't work. I want to try to play the video. Let's see if it works. Oh, it's not working. Let's see. Okay, maybe it won't play. So I want to provide now a little bit of more context. There's a book called The Holocaust in American Life by Peter Novick. Some people might know it. And, there's a lot covered in this book, right? It's a huge topic. But part of Novick's thesis about the process by which the Holocaust became what he describes as sort of Americanized, Anne Frank's diary played a really important role. So I just want to share a few key excerpts from this book that kind of set up the context for Ozick's essay. So by far the best known representation of the Holocaust in the 1950s was the adaptation of Anne Frank's diary to stage and screen by the husband-wife team of Albert Hackett and Frances Goodrich. The 1955 Broadway play was a box office smash that won a Pulitzer Prize, the Tony Award for Best Play, and the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. And as I think Novick does a good job of describing how at the time the play was really hailed by Jewish groups and highly promoted. The National Community Relations Advisory Council, the coordinating body of leading Jewish organizations, enthusiastically recommended the film for its portrayal of Jews finding solace and strength in their Jewishness, for its depiction of the selfless courage of Christians who risked their lives to save Jews from the Nazis, and for its evocation of horror and revulsion against the Nazi program of Jewish extermination. But there was also a backlash that took a little bit longer. So what captured, this is also from Novick, what captured audiences in the 1950s was Anne's universalism, both in character and in outlook, together with her luminous optimism. That was precisely what outraged some writers in the 1990s. Among those who inveigh against the universalizing or de-Judaizing of the Holocaust, the Hackett's adaptations are repeatedly invoked as the most egregious examples of this process. Exhibit A in the case for the prosecution. And I should say, if there's a lead prosecutor, I would say it's probably Cynthia Ozick. But this has a longer history. So Meyer Levin, who comes up in Ozick's essay, a writer an American writer who did much to bring not only the diary to English language publication, but also worked tirelessly to get a different kind of play adaptation made. Wrote to Otto Frank, Anne's father, that he was, quote, disgusted and enraged at the thought that a non-Jew has been selected to write the play. To have it produced by a Gentile is scandalous beyond measure. I will not stand for this. I will write about it wherever I can. Right. So I think, this became a flashpoint, especially after Ozick's essay in the 1990s, but really there was even controversy in the 1950s. Which brings us to sort of some of the central questions I want us to be thinking about in relation to the essay. One thing I want us to think about for those who've read the essay and for those who are still going to read it is, what do you think Ozick's answer to the question of her title would be? This question of who owns Anne Frank? And also, and I don't expect you to give your answer right now over Zoom, but I want you to be thinking about how you would answer this provocative question as we kind of move through the essay, but also the series. Here, I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions or anything that anybody wants to add to the conversation. Just checking in the chat. We have one comment suggesting that after the Holocaust, we need to preserve the Jewish people by practicing our religion and teaching to our children. We have someone pointing out there's no sound. We also have someone pointing out it looked like Natalie Portman, and it was Natalie Portman, so you're right. And the revisions written by Frank are perceived as fraudulent when they were a writer amending their own text. And then we have another, Ozick answers the question of who doesn't own Anne Frank, namely not her dad, given their relationship. Yeah, so one thing I do want to get to in the conversation a little bit is the question of Leigh Ozick, the treatment of the father, right, of Otto Frank. Great. Okay, let's go back to the screen. So if I were in class, what I would be saying probably at this point is something like, I would say, well, what's Ozick's core argument, right? That might be where I start. I'd say, like, what's if you were to try to paraphrase her argument, what would it be? And feel free to take a shot at that if anybody wants to in the chat or wants to raise their hand. One thing I think about this essay is that however you want to summarize your argument, I don't think you could probably state it quite as strongly as Ozick does herself. She does not mince words in this essay. This is why, one of the reasons this entire series is titled Arguments with a Ghost, because this is an argument, right? One core argument that just dropped in the chat: Anne Frank has been commodified. And this is exactly what I mean, because you're absolutely right. But let's look at the quote where she actually says exactly that. So this is sort of the key quote, where you could try to summarize this, but I think you couldn't possibly say this as strongly as Ozick says it. So according to Ozick, the story of Anne Frank in the 50 years since The Diary of a Young Girl was first published has been Baudelarized, distorted, transmuted, reduced. It has been infantilized, Americanized, homogenized, sentimentalized, falsified, kitschified, and in fact, blatantly and arrogantly denied. Among the falsifiers have been dramatists and directors, translators and litigators, Anne Frank's own father, and even, or especially, the public, both readers and theatergoers all over the world. Just to pause, that means us, right? Because a lot of us are people who've read the diary or have seen the play. Ozick continues, a deeply truth-telling work has been turned into an instrument of partial truth, surrogate truth, or anti-truth. The pure has been made impure, sometimes in the name of the reverse. Almost every hand that has approached the diary with the well-meaning intention of publicizing it has contributed to the subversion of history. So it's a lot, right? Like I said, Ozick is not someone who sort of holds back. I want to just now move into give everybody a chance to react in their own way. For those who haven't read the essay, I do want to say, so what I think is so interesting about the essay is that, right, this text that I just put on the screen, clearly, this is a polemic, right? This is a really strongly stated argument with a real critical perspective on the cultural history of Anne Frank's diary and its reception, and particularly in the United States, since Anne Frank's death in Bergen-Belsen. And at the same time, it's also a really, really interesting cultural history in its own right, describing that process of reception. So, you can learn a lot from the essay, even if you disagree with Anne Frank. So when I teach this in class, we have a debate, right? And no one can agree exactly on the central question that Ozick is asking. Some people strongly agree with this paragraph that I just read aloud. Some people are taken completely aback and push back and strongly disagree. And keep in mind that these are college kids, right? And a lot of them, are taking my class, because they read The Diary of Anne Frank when they were, say, in middle school, right? This is how many, especially American students, are first introduced to that subject in schools. So it's a really provocative argument. I can't underline that enough. Okay. So here's what I want to do. I want to pause for a second, and I want to ask all of you if there was a line from Ozick's essay that provoked the strongest reaction in you. Obviously, it could be the line I just read, but if there's some other sentence or idea, if you want to put it in the chat, or again, feel free to pipe in and Zoom if you're interested. You're more than welcome to kind of speak up. But I'm curious if there's one sentence from the essay that you underlined or highlighted or were kind of gasped at or were really surprised by. So I'm going to pause for a second and have a sip of water and give you a chance to see if there's any idea that really, and I'm going to have to save mine till the end. So I promise I'll reveal my answer. I'm looking for the sentence, even her father. If anybody can give me a page number on the PDF or read the sentence or drop the whole sentence, I'd love to see it, because I agree that actually, to give you kind of a spoiler, I guess, that some of the lines about the father were the ones that really jumped out at me. In the meantime, we have a question. What was Otto Frank's motivations, to the extent one can know, for choosing to not go with the original playwright? The implication was that it was for financial gain. I don't know the answer to that question. At least in Ozick's account, that question is sort of skipped over, right? The implication is that the Hackett's, right, the playwrights who end up adapting it, were a big deal, right? I think they'd written Father of the Bride and a few other hits, and my understanding is that Otto Frank really wanted this story to be told far and wide. And I think that this is actually one of the really interesting tensions behind, or one of the points of disagreement that comes up in my classes, where some people say, well, of course, you could have a small adaptation that no one sees, that no one pays attention to, that wouldn't have the same sort of reach. Other people, I've had students argue that, like, of course, you want as many eyes on this story as possible. Okay, so let me go back to the chat. Some people are asking about the PDF. Yeah, the PDF, sorry, the PDF hasn't been sent out yet. I realize that now that I'm looking at a PDF, but other people probably found either access through the web link or have copies without different page numbers. So we have one quote from Lauren: "The diary's keen lens is helplessly opaque to the diarist's explicit doom. And this opacity, replicated in young readers in particular, has led to shamelessness." Yeah, what a sentence, right? When I said, I don't know if you, maybe the beginning of my comments, I brought up the fact that this is, there's something to me like Henry Jamesian about this sentence, where you're following along, right? The first part you can follow along because it's been set up. This is the idea that Ozick makes, the point that Ozick makes about how one reason that it's so perverse in her view that the Diary of Anne Frank has become what she calls, in quotations, right, a Holocaust document, is because it doesn't actually document the camps, right? It doesn't document the circumstances of Anne's death. And sort of this opacity here is replicated in young readers in particular. But it's the word shamelessness, right, that kind of shocks at the end of the sentence, at least for me, and kind of surprises. And that's even in the complex syntax of that quotation, a great one to share. The shamelessness of appropriation. I think that's a really smart reading of what Ozick's getting at here. And she uses that term, appropriation. I was sort of hoping the conversation would turn to this really complicated issue of Anne's relationship with her father, and the way Ozick really turns the father figure into almost a kind of villain of the story. We have one person writing in the chat that Otto Frank, it turns out, is complicit in this shallowly upbeat view. Again and again, in every conceivable context, he is at his aim to emphasize Anne's idealism and spirit, almost never calling attention to how and why that idealism and spirit were smothered, and unfailingly generalizing the sources of hatred. Yeah, this is really key and central to the case that that Ozick is building, right? That builds toward the conclusion of the essay, which I'll get to soon. And actually, you already anticipated where I was going, Eugene. Actually, this is the quote that shocks me, which we're going to come back to in just a minute, Eugene, because it's the last line of the piece. We'll return to that. Okay, we have another quote. Otto continued his assimilating and false consciousness even to the point of betraying his own daughter. Yeah, so this is right. So there's another piece of the representation of Otto Frank and the critique that Ozick is building, which is about Otto Frank's assimilationism, which she treats quite critically. in introducing Otto Frank and his life story and the story of the Frank family. So here's the quote. The atrocities she endured were ruthlessly and purposefully devised, from indexing by tattoo through systematic starvation to factory efficient murder. She was designated to be erased from the living, to leave no grave, no sign, no physical trace of any kind. Her fault, her crime, was having been born a Jew. And as such, she is classified among those who had no right to exist, not as a subject people, not as an inferior breed, not even as usable slaves. I mean, it's painful, like, as I'm reading it. And this is what I mean about Ozick's prose, right? Like, it's completely unforgiving. And you can see it almost in the style of the essay, that she's trying to create a kind of almost aesthetic and ethical approach to her own writing style that in some ways is meant as a response or rejoinder to the kind of what she takes as the forced optimistic kind of reception of Anne Frank's story, right? So the very tone of the essay is meant to be kind of an antidote to what she sees as that kind of appropriation of Anne Frank's story, and especially in the American context. We come back to the shamelessness of appropriation, and someone else brings that quote up. Yeah, I mean, this question of appropriation is absolutely central, I think, and comes up again. It's interesting. There's one line in the essay where Ozick, right? Yeah, it's the exact quote you're mentioning, right? It comes, we're nearing midway point of the essay, and this is the first moment when Anne Frank, when the question comes up, literally the quote, "Who owns Anne Frank?" But the sentence that precedes it is the shamelessness of appropriation. So clearly this is at the core of the question that Ozick is asking. So you're absolutely right to identify this quotation is totally key to the point that we're making. So Eileen points out, I think it's impossible to imagine how any of us would have addressed this matter, given that what Otto had to live with through is beyond comprehension. And Eileen, I appreciate that. So, I mean, again, when I teach this in class, I think we end up spending a lot of time talking about Otto Frank. And, I read this essay when the sort of power of Ozick's prose and intellect and the force of her argument almost strike me speechless after I finish reading it every time. But then once that kind of wave of impact kind of recedes, the first thing that always occurs to me is a sense of like feeling really queasy and a little bit bad about the way that Otto Frank is treated in the essay. I don't know if any of you agree with that, but given what he'd been through, I think he's given quite harsh treatment in the essay. Okay, those were really helpful quotations to identify, and you're all very good readers because those are, I think, the key quotations that I would have pointed to as well. These aren't questions that we're going to be able to grapple with right now, but I did want to bring up the other questions that I think are really interesting, because I do want to leave some time for questions and also to set up the next reading, because we're already approaching an hour. So these are some of the questions that I think are really pertinent to thinking through this essay. We just talked about one. How does Ozick treat Anne's father, Otto Frank? Do you think his treatment is fair? I kind of tipped my hat about how I feel about that. Should Otto have edited Anne's journal before publication? That's a really interesting question. I think pretty central to the case that Ozick builds also about some of the things that were cut from the journal, both about Anne's adolescent sexuality, but also about the Jewish practice. Should Anne Frank's diary have been adapted into a play or film at all? And if so, who should or shouldn't have been involved? Once I'm really curious if, as people are reading the essay, Meyer Levin initially comes in as a really sympathetic character for Ozick, right? He's the one who's sort of pushed out of the process and replaced by the Hackett's, sort of the Hollywood sort of blockbuster makers. And so I'm curious kind of how you all react to that question. An interesting thing that comes up in the essay also is identification is presented as a problem. In other words, Ozick seems to think it's a problem that a young reader will identify, or an audience member would identify with Anne, and that there's something obscene about that identification. And I'm wondering if you all agree with that. Because I think this comes to the core of the issue. I teach a lot of ASU students who are training to be high school teachers. And so it's interesting what they have to say, because they're thinking through this really complex question of how do you get young students now in 2025 to start thinking about the Holocaust, right? And is sort of this step where they might identify with the voice of Anne Frank's diary. Is that, do you think that that is a productive step? Or do you think that in some ways that there's something that presents some kind of problem in the sense that Ozick seems to think? These are the last two questions are kind of going to hover over the lecture series. They're bigger questions. Like, why do you think Anne Frank has played such a central role in Holocaust memory culture, either internationally or in the United States in particular? I mean, I think it's an interesting question. How did this become such a paradigmatic text? How and why? And Nozick tells some of that story, but I think there's room for other reflections on that question. This is one I think is really interesting that I in particular want us to think about as we set up, as we move forward. So this is a quote that Ozick brings up in her essay. Commemoration, the French cultural critic, as Svetlana Todorov explains, is always the adaptation of memory to the needs of today. It's a really interesting quotation. Commemoration is always the adaptation of memory to the needs of today. First of all, I'll just kind of observe that the suggestion here is that there's some level of appropriation that's inevitable. So what role, if you agree with Todorov, what role should Anne Frank's memory play today, if any, in 2025, right? As we get further and further away from the events depicted in the diary and Anne Frank's death in Bergen-Belsen in 1945. I'll pause here just in case anybody urgently wants to weigh in on any of these questions, but obviously we're not going to have time to really go through each one by one. Eileen suggests that Ozick's not seeing it as a problem that children identify with Anne. She's seeing the milk toasting of Anne and the identification with that inauthentic version as being problematic. Yeah, that's a really important correction to the gloss that I provided, right? To be very clear, Ozick is actually paradoxically quite reverent of Anne Frank. But the version of Anne Frank that she reveres is very different than the one she thinks has been presented us through the adaptations of her diary, right? So I think Eileen's raising a really interesting point and question, actually, about whether, if the version of Anne Frank that Ozick writes about were the one who'd been presented to us in the decades since her death, whether she'd feel differently about this last question that I want to, or last quotation that Eugene brought up in the chat that I want to make sure we turn to. Because for me, this was the moment that it still takes my breath away every time I read the essay. So this is the last line. So I should say the penultimate line of the essay, to set this up, right? Hold on, my version is locked. There we go. So it talks about the woman who discovered and saved the diary, right? It was Miep Gies, the uncommon heroine of this story, a woman profoundly good, a failed savior who succeeded in rescuing an irreplaceable masterwork. That is the manuscript of the diary. And then comes this line, the final line of the essay. It may be shocking to think this. I am shocked as I think it, but one can imagine a still more salvational outcome. Anne Frank's diary burned, vanished, lost, saved from a world that made it of it all things, some of them true, while floating lightly over the heavier truth of named and inhabited evil. This is the quote that takes my breath away every time I read it, and I take as incredibly powerful challenge to any kind of ethical reasoning about Holocaust memory. And I think it really actually does tie to this sort of point that Eileen dropped in the chat about sort of like, well, what might, is there a version of this story that Ozick, like what would it have taken for Ozick? Like Ozick goes so far with this statement, right? And it makes you wonder, like, can we imagine a version of this of this reception history, of this cultural history? What would it have taken to change Ozick's position? Is it as simple as maybe Otto Frank hadn't made those edits, those cuts from the manuscript, or is it's a matter of the adaptation, and if the adaptation had never happened? You know, those kind of counterfactual questions animate my imagination, and we're going to talk a little bit about counterfactual questions in our next lecture. Quick question, Lisa, how long are we supposed, or Hava, how long are we supposed to go here before I take up too much time from everybody?
We usually go between an hour to an hour and 20.
Perfect. So then I'm going to round out like sort of my comments and let people ask questions or chime in and kind of go where we want. And then I'll say just a word about the Roth novel before we go. Gabby says, I think lurking underneath is that Ozick felt a kinship with Anne. Generationally, they were the same, and both Jewish female writers. Ozick lionizes Anne's nascent writing talent. She saw herself as Anne in Anne. I'm so fascinated by this point. I think I'm so glad you bring this up, because we brought up the question of identification, right? Anne is presented as a writer, and I want to underscore this. This is going to be really important for our next conversation in a month. And so I want to really, I don't even want to necessarily comment on this because I just want to read it and let you all think about it a little bit. I think lurking underneath is that Ozick felt a kinship with Anne. Generationally, they were the same, and both Jewish female writers. Ozick lionizes Anne's nascent writing talent. She saw herself in Anne. Just gonna let that hang out in the air for a minute. Yes, please. You have your hand up, Leslie. Oh, can you unmute yourself?
I think I feel much like you do about how grueling it is to read this, no matter how many times you read it, because it brings up so many different questions, and it's impossible. I think it's impossible to come to one point where you say that's the only answer, this is all, because one of the things that she suggests toward the end, I mean, which is something else to think about, and I have, is what if there had never been the diary in the first place? And when you think about that in terms of especially American culture, the loss of that, the absence of it in this country, for sure. What else was there? I mean, what else is there now? I mean, there are other things, but the majority of people know this one text. And so I think that's something important to think about. I mean, in addition to all of the other stuff and what's going on right now in terms of the book being banned in so many libraries, and there's so many questions, and it's not easy. It's not easy.
No, this is not an easy essay, right? And it's look, I mean, and to put a further point on it, I don't agree with all of this essay at all, to be honest. I mean, I've kind of tried to hold back some of my own opinions to the extent I'm able to, but I absolutely, I mean, to me, it's one of the most astounding things I've ever read in this genre. I teach it constantly. And I just want to report to you all that this essay just like lights a fire under my students, right? This makes them think in really complex ways about issues, the exact issues that I want them to think about, and I think we want them to think about. And to just throw another paradox out there, but if the diary didn't exist, if it had been destroyed, we wouldn't have this essay. We wouldn't be asking these questions. So yeah, the counterfactual questions pile up, I think. Thank you.
Brian, did you see the Q&A?
Oh, no, I didn't. Thank you. Right, separate from the chat. That's super helpful. Ozick does identify as a writer. Ozick's student, Dara Horn, does the same. There's a chain of recognition of evil that Ozick, Horn, and Frank, laser focus remains. Yeah, laser focus is a good way of putting it, right? There's something sharp and crystalline in kind of her thinking and her writing. Yeah, no, I mean, this is why when I organized the readings, it hadn't occurred to me that maybe we should throw Dara Horn in there. But I'll do my own homework and think if we can bring Dara Horn into our last conversation as a more contemporary voice that weighs in on these issues. But there's a chain of recognition I would extend, right, that I think we need to include. Well, next time, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I really do actually think that it's very, very interesting to put Philip Roth's novel, The Ghostwriter, in conversation with this essay also, in direct conversation. Thank you, that's really helpful. Eileen writes, Anne's diary was almost the only exposure to the Holocaust, with the possible exception of Franklin Wiesel's writing. Most people had for decades. Yeah, I know, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing. So this is like it's paradoxes pile upon paradoxes, right? So it's like, on the one hand, and there's some really good theoretical criticism about Holocaust literature in the US context. One of the arguments that I think is really interesting is the way that like almost how text become personified, right? Like the diary becomes almost a relic of Anne Frank, and the way that function is not always healthy for memory culture. That's Amy Hungerford's argument. It gets really complicated, especially when we only have a few of these texts that are taught over and over again. This was coming up as a problem for me when I was sort of designing our master's online course. I said, you know, do I assign Primo Levi? What if people have read it? What if it's always Primo Levi? But how could you not read Primo Levi? So I think the answer, of course, is we should make everybody read lots of things, but being aware of like the demands of creating syllabi and canonization, especially in secondary education, there's a reason that we have these few texts that get taught over and over again, but it's a problem. Let's see what else we have. Is this program recorded? I believe it is. Yeah. But if Anne Frank's diary had not been there, why wouldn't Eva Hoffman or Peter Gint's diaries fill that vacuum? Why do we think only Anne Frank could fill that niche? I mean, we'll never know. Yeah, exactly. We'll never know. I mean, I think that that's part of the question. It's like, you know, did something have to fill this space, or what would have happened if nothing did? I mean, I think it's when you hear the way Ozick lays out the story and the contingencies of the story, I think it's hard to imagine that another text would have become a sort of Broadway hit. And then a sort of widely distributed film and be sort of hyper canonized in this way. There would have been something, but I doubt it would have taken on the cultural significance of what Anne Frank has become. I find it impossible to imagine personally, just especially when you read Ozick's essay. But of course, I could be wrong. We'll never know. In terms of a recording, will we receive a copy? I think usually they get posted.
Yes.
We'll
yes.
send out a link to the recording.
Yeah, great. Are there any other questions, or should I just say a word about the Roth novel?
So
Is
I
that
have a
better?
question for you, Brian, if you can,
Yeah.
as we're trying to reach toward the end, can you locate Ozick on the spectrum of Jewishness in America? I actually don't know much about her Jewishness. Is she Orthodox?
Yeah.
Is she, what kind of a Jew is she, to put it bluntly?
I'm not sure exactly. I'd say more on the conservative end of the spectrum. But she's idiosyncratic. I mean, like, I would say, like, if you compare her to, say, Philip Roth, who we're going to read next, right? She's on the one hand, on the question of Jewishness, she's on the other end of the spectrum, right? They're almost extremes on this. Like, when we go return to the quote about, Ozick defending a kind of vision of particularism as a defining factor of American Jewish identity. Roth is sort of almost saying the opposite, right? Where he's going after the universal, right? And although he's coy about that, which we can talk about next time, I think there's a lot of ambivalence there, despite some of the things he says. So yeah, I mean, the blunt answer is I would say that probably takes Jewish practice much more seriously than, say, some of the secular writers that I teach in the course, right? But again, she's slippery and tricky in the way she writes. Her writing is extremely ironic. There is still a family resemblance with other writers of her generation, including Roth, right? I don't even know where to sort of tell you to look in terms of her fiction, but the other texts that I write, I do think that ultimately, for her, right, the consecrated text is the literary text. And I think in particular, something that I think deals with this theme in terms of the disappearance of the Yiddish language that's really interesting is this long novella called Envy, which, I've taught in class and the students have a hard time with it, but I think I couldn't recommend it enough if you're interested. That deals with, I think, the question that you're asking. It's a question that she poses in the story through several Yiddish language writers who are trying to make it in America, right? And so that question is of sort of Jewishness is refracted through the Yiddish language in a really interesting way.
To me, she sounds very much like Adorno.
Oh,
Adorno, yeah, because
Yeah.
she's critical. She's very critical of the schmaltzy American culture.
Totally.
Right? So she, as much as Adorno was, obviously she's not going to do what he did, but she hates the commodification of culture. She hates this, everything becomes sweet and, accessible.
Well,
Doesn't want it to be sweet and accessible. And I'm very intrigued by the word salvational that she uses in that last quote. In a sense, she wants us to go beyond all that. And the salvation will be if we did not have to deal with this kind of evil, I guess.
Yeah, again, but the sacralization of literature is so key to the story of this generation, and the particular form of secularism that animates American Jewish literary culture. And I mean, I think the Adorno connection is not accidental. I think that I'm always struck by the parallels between the Frankfurt School and the New York intellectuals that are kind of intellectual formations. They did connect, but like they're kind of. But the New York intellectuals, in some sense, are in part because they're so well. You have like on our end, you have these actual interlocutors, but they're actually helping pave the way for the reception of these complicated critical theories from Europe and the United States. And they're dialectical thinkers, and they're also highbrow in their kind of cultural tastes. So I think the connection's absolutely there, and this is sort of the air that that Ozick's raised in.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So
modern Orthodox. We got the answer. Ozick belongs to a modern Orthodox synagogue.
Oh,
traditionally observant, but not out of habit, but out of simple fascination. That's a really great quote.
okay, good. That's good to know. You know, she was in a major debate against Judith Plaskow about feminism. So when feminism came
Yeah.
out, she went totally against especially feminist theology. So there's a big debate. Is the question of Jewish women or women in general, is it sociological or is it theological? And she argued for the sociological. And Judith Plaskow said, no, the issue is how do we think about God? What kind of language we use? So that's why I wasn't sure where to locate her. So in a sense, that makes sense actually. But
it's complicated. So if people are interested, my students really had fun with this. So there's like this documentary. It's a little hard to find, but you can find clips on YouTube where there's this. Maybe some of you know about this already, but there's a famous town hall in the 1970s where for some reason they let Norman Mailer moderate a debate about feminism. And, you know, we have in the audience, you know, Cynthia Ozick and Susan Sontag sort of taking him down a notch. Yeah, it's worth checking out. But I do think that one thing I love about Ozick's criticism in her essays is she's a little bit hard to pin down, I think, also politically. So I find that interesting about her as a writer.
Interesting.
Great. Any other questions? This is great. We had a great conversation.
No, I was going to chime in about her rejection of the schmaltzy Americanization, commodification, that was kind of emblematic of that generation. That was my grandparents' generation. And I'm also from the Bronx, so that kind of a lot of her direct and bluntness, it's endemic. It's absolutely endemic. You can compare it to Adorno, but you know, the milieu out of where she comes, it's built in.
I think, Gabby, that's what I was trying to, I didn't say it the right way, but one thing I think I was trying to suggest is like, what I think is so interesting about her prose is like, you have the directness of exactly that you're describing that I think is from her cultural milieu, and it was shared with the New York intellectuals who also were from places like she was, right? And on the other hand, there's like this kind of like Henry James, complicated sentences. So you're both direct, but you're also like stylized. I don't know.
No, she liked to find word now and again, to quote Beatrix Potter. She liked to find word now and again. Yeah, Henry James, you want to compare it to, but it's also that love that comes from speaking Yiddish. It's an incredibly florid language. So yeah, it might have some influence there.
That makes, I think you're absolutely right. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, I mean, it's getting late, so I don't want to, I'll save the slides on Roth for next time. But because I don't want to spoil the novel, right? For those who haven't read it. And when you start reading it, you're going to be like, what the heck does this have to do with Ozick's essay, right? When you start reading it, you're going to think it has nothing to do with Ozick's essay. But I maybe I'll just go into greater detail on the background when we discuss the novel in a month. But I did want to say that the first two parts of the novel are kind of, well, what I was going to do in kind of greater detail is suggest that the novel is kind of a double portrait, self-portrait. At least that's what it seems to be when you start reading it, of Roth as the sort of accomplished writer he was when the novel was published in the 1970s, but it's also a portrait of the artist as a young man. He's looking back 20 years to the mid 1950s when he was the protagonist, Nathan Zuckerman, who, for those who read Roth novels, will know is sort of sometimes taken as kind of a autobiographical stand-in, although that's dangerous, is a young writer who's just making it, and he makes a pilgrimage to an older writer, to his sort of country retreat, his farmhouse in the Berkshire Hills, and becomes entangled in a set of sort of domestic disputes. At least that's what it seems the novel's about. It's about all the things we talked about today, actually, and more. As you'll discover, I don't want to spoil what happens. I will say that one thing, the controversy, there's a story within the story. The young author has published a story called Higher Learning, and it's caused a huge controversy amongst his family members for its portrayal of sort of a middle-class Jewish family in Newark, and in particular drawn sort of the approbation of or the criticism of sort of a local luminary in the Jewish community of Newark, and Zuckerman's parents ask this rabbi to intervene, and sends Zuckerman a letter with a questionnaire. And pay attention to that questionnaire, because I think it sets up where we're going to go with our reading of the story when you get to it. But I just wanted to mention, and I'll say more about this next time, but this is based on a real experience. So Roth, one of the first stories that helped him make it into the mainstream in the 1950s, was a story called Defender of the Faith that he published in the New Yorker. And it was about, it was set during the end of the Second World War, but it was set in a military base in the US. And there's a Jewish sergeant on the base, and he's overseeing, he's in charge of a Jewish enlisted soldier, and who starts asking for special favors on account of their shared background. And so that's the setup for that story. Roth publishes it in the New Yorker in the late 1950s. And it's a huge, you wouldn't, if you read it now, when my students read it, they don't believe it, but hugely controversial when it was published. And the New Yorker got dozens of letters. I can share some of the letters in a month. And so this was sort of Roth's first brush with controversy. So the novel kind of opens by kind of fictionalizing that episode and raising some of these questions. But Anne Frank enters this story in a really surprising way that I don't want to discuss any further for fear of spoiling the novel. But I will say, like my poor father, who was all excited for tonight, and read all three of the texts because he thought we were discussing all three today. And then at the last minute, I asked him to take my son to soccer practice because it was scheduled at the same time as our meeting. So he didn't even get to attend. But he said, take it from him. He loved the novel. I think for people who are skeptical of Philip Roth, and there are those out there who've only read Portnoy's Complaint, this to me is his great. This is his masterpiece. It's his most interesting novel. I think it's most formally accomplished novel, and it's short. So give it a shot.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Brian, for this. Really, you did two things. You introduced us to this very complex set of issues, right? How to construct memory, how not to be co-opted by American culture and so forth. But also you show that it's doable, that we can actually have a conversation online with people sitting in various places in the United States. That's marvelous. So I really appreciate your patience with all the technological challenges. And thank you also to Lisa, who made possible this meeting as well as many others. And I think we're going to all look forward to, what is it, February 26th. That's our meeting on Wednesday. So we'll do our best to read everything and the entire novel, obviously. And we thank all of you who joined us for this. This is not intellectual entertainment. I would say this is really an intellectual learning experience. And that's why I'm so happy that we were able to do this kind of a format. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and thank you, Brian.
Thank you, everybody. I really did. I learned a lot from all of you. Every time that's why I love teaching this essay, because I always learn things from people who read it. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, it's wonderful.